If you want to draw excellent portraits, you must learn how to put your heads into perspective. By mastering these two critical steps, you'll get it right every time. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Brian Knox, and this is the second video in my tutorial series, Intro to Head Drawing, where I take you through the process of drawing the human head and how to approach each step to drawing excellent heads from any angle. If you haven't seen the first video in this series, I would recommend pausing here to watch the first tutorial, then coming back to watch this one. Each video in this series builds upon the last, so it'll be helpful to follow along in order. In this video, I will teach you the second step in any head drawing, finding the center line and establishing the thirds. Finding the center line is a key step to drawing the head in perspective, and it will act as a core reference point for all other forms and features to relate back to. It will help you to create a proportional and symmetrical head drawing. The thirds will establish proper proportions between the facial features and keep everything working in perspective. Although we generalize by calling these points thirds, in reality they can vary a bit from person to person. Over time, you'll learn to adjust them to match the individual that you're drawing. These two steps are essential to every head drawing you will ever do. Mastering them will allow you to draw accurate, dynamic heads with excellent perspective. So let's get started. We're going to start with the big shape of the head, which is what we talked about last week, right? And figure out a couple different head shapes, and then how to apply the next step of the process, right? Which is going to be finding the center line and then breaking the head down into thirds. And we'll talk about exactly what that means and how it applies to two different types of heads. And then we'll take a quick look about how those third lines work in perspective a little bit, right? Like what happens if we're looking up at a head or looking down at a head. We're just going to do subtle up or down a little bit, nothing too extreme. We'll cover that in future videos. And let's go ahead and take a look right now. So here, first thing we're going to do is draw two different head types, right? To kind of just explore what the difference is. So if you're familiar with Loomis, and I know Loomis is a really popular method, right? I mean, it's how I learned too at the school that I went to. And I had some problems with it, frankly. Like I had a really hard time making it work. And over the years, I've come to realize why and what the differences are between what I do now that works and what I was trying to do back then that doesn't. And it's partly what these videos are about. Not entirely, I mean, they're just about head drawing, but we'll talk about those differences when they come up. And this is going to be one of them, right? So we're going to start just with the big shape of the head here, just like we did last week, right? Very simple head shape. Kind of cut the sides of the ball off a little bit. Drops down this way, kind of like a slightly rounded shape here, right? Drops down that way. And then we look for the jaw, right? Which is going to sit right down here. Right, so we find the big shape of the head. Move our construction lines. Now, what happens next, right? We need to find where the chin sits, which on her, since we're looking right at her, it's going to be right in the middle. And we're going to keep things simple. There's some complex things that can happen with the center line and how they relate to the two-cylinder and chin and the connection point of the nose. We're not going to worry about that this week. We'll talk about that in future weeks, in future videos, and right now we're going to think about just the center line coming up from the center of the chin and keep it simple this time. Right, so the center line comes up from the center of the chin. And is that always the case? No, but it is for right now. Right, comes up that way. Next, we're going to do what Loomis does, right? So we're going to come in here, we're going to find the hairline. Sits right up here. You know, on her, it sits a little low on the head. She has kind of a larger cranial mass shape a little bit. Right? And then we're going to break this space into thirds. Right? Equal thirds. Just like Loomis, we have hairline, brow line, nose line, and then chin. Right? And so we're going to measure, make sure these are perfectly equal, which I can already tell they're a little bit off. So we need to come up a little bit. Right, here to here. Now it's too big. That one's the same. Okay, readjust. Pull this down a little bit. Pull this down a little bit. This one, that one, that one. So equal thirds, right? That's pretty close. Pull this up a little bit. Just like Loomis. Her head fits those proportions almost perfectly. You know, if you pause the video and try and measure on the screen, I think you'll see that it works very well. So very Loomis-like proportions. And then we're just going to extend them out, right? Just let them run all the way across here. Right, nose maybe doesn't have to go quite as far. But I didn't do that quite evenly. Let's adjust that a little bit. There we go. The ear typically will sit right in this middle third. Again, that's another kind of Loomis concept. But you'll find that that's often not the case. People typically have, not typically, but a lot of the time, have ears that'll sit naturally a little bit higher or lower. It's very common. They don't always sit right in that middle third. Right, so that's just one head type, right? Another thing I see pretty commonly is more like this type of head, right? So if we look at this head, we'll see a cranial mass shape about like this, right? And then we'll find the side plane of the head coming down this way, which on him is very straight. Not as curved, right? More of a straighter head type coming down this way. And then we find the jaw attaching down here at a little bit more of an angle. Right? This one was a little flatter. This one's angled a little bit more. Little subtle differences. Remove our construction lines. Just like the other one, the chin now is right in the middle. On the center line, straight up the middle. Now, on him, those thirds don't work evenly, right? What you'll notice is his hairline, it sits fairly low. But then with the way his head is, the top two thirds are equal. But the bottom third is larger, right? Like it's like a chin, like a half a chin to a chin's length longer than the top two thirds, right? So we need to figure out what those measurements look like. So we'll have top two thirds there and there. I think those are a little bit small. I think those are a little bit bigger. And then measure. Okay, these two are pretty equal, right? This one, that seems about right. That's about, I don't know, half a chin length longer down here, right? So that's exactly what we need for his head type. But notice, it doesn't conform to those equal thirds. It's a little bit different, you know, and that's something that took me a long time to figure out, is that's a very common head type. My head works that way. I mean, it happens pretty frequently. And you need to be able to look at a person and recognize when that's happening. So what happens next, right? We can find kind of the side plane of the head, which you'll notice we can see when we look at the head from the front, which is interesting, right? That means that the front of the head is actually a little more narrow than the back. So it's actually shaped like this a little bit, right? So we're seeing some of the side plane of the head when we look at it from the front. One thing people frequently ask is, how do you know where to put the brow line, right? How does the brow line relate back to the head? And the answer is it sits right where the eyebrows meet in the center of the forehead, right? Which is the top of the glabella. The glabella is that little keystone shape that sits at the top of the nose. And you can see here, if you look at the skull, I have a skull here, you can see this little flat spot right here, right? On some people it's very obvious, and you can see it pretty clearly. On other people it's very subtle and hard to see. On her you can't really see it much. On him you can see it a little bit more maybe. But what we need to know is that this is basically the point where the eyebrow starts, right? And so if you just look to where the eyebrow starts, that is the point that that line is going to run through. You can see it if I hold it to the side, you can see it a little bit better, that little flat spot. Notice also when we look at this, and this is going to come into play in the following videos more than today, but if we run a line right through this point, it actually sits above the opening of the eye socket, right? And that's really important, and something that we'll be talking about in the future is how we can use that for construction purposes. But that is our third line right here, and then the connection point of the nose right down here, and then the chin, and then the hairline sits, of course, up here. Right? But how does that apply to our 3/4 view? So we'll take a look at that right now. Say we're looking up at a head a little bit. Not a lot, just a little bit. Again, these aren't extreme views, but they're enough that we're going to get some perspective on the head. So if you remember from last week, his head has a fairly round cranial mass. Even if we're looking at it in a 3/4 view, it's still pretty round, right? So from there, the head's going to wrap around this way a little bit, right, for the side plane. Get the back part wrapping down this way, right, and then connecting up through the jaw down here, right, coming down this way, connecting up to the chin, right about here. Right, we're going to pull the center line up from the chin. Right, just keep it very simple this week. Center line comes up from the chin. We have the back of the jaw and the front of the ear, right, sitting back here. Now, what happens next? We're looking up at him, right? So we're going to have the hairline a little bit higher maybe. And then we're going to have to consider those thirds, but how are they wrapping around the head, right? So we're going to have to find our thirds first, right, which is going to be the top two being equal. That is not the case, right? Top two being equal. Bottom third a little bit larger, so that seems good. Right, but now we need to find kind of like the corner of the head, like how do we know how to wrap it around? So we need to kind of consider what happens with a box. If we're looking up at a box, what happens? Right, so here's our box. Now, I would recommend, highly recommend, studying some perspective, because being able to draw simple boxes like this without having to think about them too much is a very important skill. Boxes and cylinders, both. But say we take this space here, right, and we break that into equal thirds, right, say just like that. Now we can kind of extrude these out. Just like that, and figure out how they wrap around the box. And you'll notice with the way these lines are going, they're tilted a lot more up at the top, tilting a little bit less as they come down. So this one's tilted a lot less than this one, right? And you have to study perspective. Obviously, I don't have time in this video to go into how perspective works in any sort of extensive way. I'll just say study it. It's extremely important. It's the basis of all representational art is perspective, so you need to know it. But here's our box, right? We want to take this concept of our thirds wrapping around the box and apply it to the head. So first we have to figure out where the corner sits. Corner sits, I'm going to say about here. And how do I know that? Well, that's kind of complicated. And we're going to be talking about that more in the next video. But we're not going to get into this one because it's going to take up too much time. And I want to keep this kind of simple. Remember, angled more here, a little less down here, right? So we're going to start with this part a little more angled for our hairline. Brow line is going to sit a little less angled. Nose line, a little less than that. Chin, less than that. Okay, and then they're going to come up and wrap around the other side. Just like that. Right? His ear, you'll notice, in theory, remember, according to Loomis, the ear sits right in this middle third. So it should sit right here. And I'd say that works okay. It's a little bit high. His ear naturally sits a little bit low. So remember, one of the things we have to look for is when people kind of deviate from our measurements. So you can see how we're taking the same concept from the box and wrapping it around the head. And we can even find a little bit of the side plane of the head real quick. Right, sitting right around here. But again, that's more stuff we'll get into in the next video. And we'll get into kind of how the brow structure can be created out of this and stuff like that. So let's do one more and look at what happens when we look down at the head. Right, so we're going to start with our big shape. Now in this case, the head's turned a little bit farther, right? So we're starting to pick up a little bit more of an oval shape for the cranial mass. Right, about like that. And then we have the front of the head. Back part's going to swoop down this way and down through the jaw, back down here, and then his chin right back here. Clean it up a little bit. Find kind of where the back of the jaw and the front of the ears sit, which is kind of like right back here, right at a little bit of an angle. Again, pull the center line up from the chin. And yeah, there's some interesting stuff that can happen here, but we'll talk about that later. Now notice, here we're seeing a lot of the top of the head, if you kind of look at the reference, and that's because we're looking down at him. So again, if we kind of relate this back to a box real quick. So here we're looking down at our box now. What happens? Well, now we're seeing the top of the box, right? Which tells me that we need to see more of the top of this head, which means the hairline is going to drop down, right? And sit lower, like down here probably. And then on top of that, we're going to figure out kind of where those third lines would sit, right here and here, and figure out how they're going to wrap around the box. Right, something like that. Again, same concept as before, where the lines are getting more angled as they go down. Right? This one, more angled. And then depending on how much perspective there is, that might happen more, it might happen less. It's possible, especially in photos, right? Like if you get back from someone and zoom in on them, that has the effect of flattening out the perspective. So you have to really pay attention to what's going on in the photo. So let's kind of figure out how that works here. Remember, on his head, we have the top 2/3 being equal and the bottom third a little bit larger, right? So we have these two kind of equal, bottom one a little bit larger. I think we can make these a little bit bigger. Boom, boom, boom. That's probably good. Okay. So a little bit bigger. All right, clean up our center line. Okay, so now we're going to figure out how these wrap around. So we're going to have kind of a more extreme angle up here, a little bit flatter angle down here. Let's see if we can kind of, or sorry, I did that backwards. Flatter angle up here, more extreme angle down here, because we're looking down at them. So it's going to be kind of like this, and then more extreme down here. And then as these work our way down, they angle a little bit more, until they end up down here. Okay, so find our corner, right? Because we're building a box. Corner is going to sit probably about here. And then we're going to wrap these around the box, right? So they're going to wrap back this way. And then his ear, remember the ear in theory should sit, pull this forward a little bit here. Should sit in this middle third, but like I said, on him, his ear naturally sits a little bit lower. So we have to learn to recognize when people kind of deviate from those measurements that we learn, right? So we're just going to have to drop his head a little, or his ear a little bit lower. It's going to sit right about down there. All right, find that side plane of the head. And again, we'll talk about that more in the next video. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So that is our next step, right? Remember, we have thirds, right? And they can work in different ways depending on the person. Usually, I don't know about usually, but a lot of the time, we'll have equal thirds. Sometimes you'll see somebody that has a slightly smaller top third. Doesn't happen very often, but every now and then you'll see a small top third, or equal, or we'll have the top two equal and the bottom one a little bit larger. Those are probably the most common variations that I see. There's others, but that's most common. There are people sometimes that have a small middle third or a slightly large middle third. I mean, it happens. Just keep in mind that you have to really pay attention to what's going on with people's heads, right? And then as we rotate the head, then as we look up at the head, we get this kind of orientation, right? Where we're getting lines kind of wrapping around the box and figuring out how to apply that to our head. And then, you know, in the next video, we'll figure out how to build on top of this and go from there. And then if we look at the down view, we get the opposite, where now we're looking down at the box, seeing more of the top of the head. Pushes the features down, you know, pushes the hairline down, and so on. So you can see real quick, as a quick little example, I kind of marked a page here. And you can see from my 20-minute heads class last term where I was using these concepts, right? And I was working through these really fast. They're little quick heads. And this one has a slight down tilt, really subtle. You can see the ear shifts up a little bit. The nose, her nose usually tilts up quite a bit, so it's a little bit flatter here than normal because her head's tilted down a little bit. This one we have the head tilted up. Now you can see I'm picking up that perspective, right? You can see the angle here, and how it gets a little flatter down here, and now the ear is sitting lower, right? And the tip of the nose moves way up because we're looking up at her. You know, same thing here, very subtle down tilt, so we have a little bit of an angle going on. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Those are the things we want to be thinking about. And in the next video, we will build on those things and figure out where to go from there. In this video, we covered how to find the center line and how to establish the thirds. We also discussed how the thirds are affected by an up or down tilt. These two steps are essential to every head drawing because they allow you to place the head in perspective and act as key anchor points for all of the forms and features that we'll draw next. Do you struggle with finding the centerline or the thirds? Leave a comment down below to let me know, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. I hope you learned something new in this tutorial, and I look forward to seeing you in the next part of this series. I'll be teaching all aspects of head drawing in this series, so stay tuned for another head drawing tutorial next week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.